Welcome to session 95 of the Bible in a Year commentary. If you started the series on the 1st of January, then today should be the 5th of April. Today we're looking at 1 Kings 4 to 7 and Psalm 95. But so far in 1st and 2nd Kings, we've read through the start of Solomon's reign. David was old and dying. His son Adonijah seized on his weakness and set himself up as king. In response, David declares Solomon as king, thwarting Adonijah's attempt at the throne. David encouraged Solomon to be faithful and loyal to God, but then told him to kill all of his enemies. Solomon then killed his brother Adonijah, as well as Joab and others. He married an Egyptian woman, despite the fact that Deuteronomy 7 warns that the intermarrying with other nations would lead them to worshipping foreign gods. It was looking bad for Solomon's reign. But then Solomon asked God for wisdom to rule well, and God blessed him with wisdom and wealth. We read the first example of Solomon using this wisdom as he judged rightly between two women claiming the same baby as their own. So let's jump in with today's reading, 1 Kings 4 to 7. Now that Solomon has received his wisdom, he needs to appoint his government. A great king is nothing if he can't get good men in place to lead his country for him. He put officers in charge of various areas of his kingdom and then picked 12 officers, presumably one over each tribe, who would provide for the king's house 1 month a year. As we see, Solomon begins to bring structure to his kingdom. We see it begin to then flourish. While David led well, there was always some battle to fight and some uprising to squash. Now with Solomon, there is plenty of food around for everyone to enjoy, and Israel is at peace. Solomon's wisdom becomes famous. He writes a lot and studies a lot, having understanding on various different topics from trees to plants, birds, reptiles, and fish. He was a Renaissance man thousands of years before the Renaissance. People from all over travel to Israel to hear him speak. Everything is looking good. But if you look closely, you can see the cracks begin to show. We read in 1 Kings 4:6 how one of the officers was over forced labour. So there were clearly a group of people he's forcing to work as slaves. We also read in 1 Kings 4 verse 26 of all the horses that Solomon had. This may not seem all that important, but way back in Deuteronomy 17, we read rules for future kings. There were 3 instructions for these kings. Do not accumulate for yourself lots of wives, gold, or horses. Solomon is already breaking one of those rules. We'll see if he breaks any more. Next, Solomon focuses on building God a temple. It was something his father David planned to do, but God had stopped him, saying the time wasn't right. Well, now the time is right. The first thing Solomon does is organise a trade deal with his friend and neighbour, Hiram. Hiram promises to send over a cedar and cypress wood so that Solomon can build the temple, and in return, Solomon provides abundant food for Hiram's household. This trade agreement shows how Israel was flourishing with its neighbouring nations as well as internally. If Israel were to be a blessing to all the nations of the earth, as we saw back in Genesis 12 verses 1 to 3, then they would need to have good relationships with these other nations. Solomon then turns his focus to his own kingdom and conscripts 30,000 men into forced labour, working 1 month in 3, mining out stone and then preparing that stone and that wood for work. The next 2 chapters go on to describe in detail how Solomon built the temple. In many ways, this is similar to the instructions for when Moses built the tabernacle back in Exodus 25 to 31. This temple is to be a house for God, and like the tabernacle, everything needs to be perfect. In the Holy of Holies, everything is gold, and there is a lot of garden imagery. Read closely and you'll see flowers, trees, and fruit carved into the walls. Have a look at 1 Kings 6 verses 29 and verse 32, and then chapter 70 verse 20. During this time, Solomon also builds a huge house for himself. Then as they move to the entrance of the temple where people would gather, the gold turns to bronze, but everything is still perfectly designed and detailed. Once the building is all finished, Solomon brings all the important items into the temple. Finally, Israel has a permanent place of worship. No longer was God meeting them in a tent that moved, this was now the set place to worship God. But that's 1 Kings 4 to 7. Now let's look at Psalm 95. This psalm is not attributed to anyone and falls into the category of praise psalm. It's part of a small collection of psalms, Psalm 93 to 99, that focus on God as King. Here's a summary of the structure, but I would recommend checking out the written version of the commentary in the description to see the structure properly for yourself. We start with verses 1 to 5, a call to praise God for his might. Verses 6 to 7, a call to worship God as shepherd. And then verses 8 to 11, a warning not to harden your heart. The psalmist starts with a call to praise. Let there be thanksgiving and a joyful noise, because he is the rock of our salvation. He is a great God, king above all other gods. In his hands are the deepest depths and the tallest mountains. Both the sea and the dry land belong to him. Next comes a call to bow and worship God as our maker. He is a shepherd and we are his sheep. He guides and sustains us. The psalmist then turns to warn the people, drawing on the story of the pool at Meribah found in Exodus 17. There the people had just been brought out of Egypt by God's miraculous power and had started to get thirsty. Rather than trust that God would provide, they complained that at least in Egypt they had water. At this point in the psalm, God takes over. He warns them not to be like their ancestors at Meribah, to not test God or demand proof. when they've seen him provide for them time and time again. And the consequences of their actions was that they wandered 40 years in the wilderness, never truly understanding God's ways and never experiencing his rest. If we want to experience God's goodness and rest, then that involves celebrating him as king over our lives and trusting that he will be his good shepherd and provide for us. Thanks for joining us today. Take a moment to reflect on what you've read and share your thoughts or questions below. If you're watching in the future, then you can click here for the next session, or you can find the full playlist just down here. To receive these daily commentaries in your email inbox, subscribe via the link in the description below. Have a great day, and I'll see you tomorrow.